The Great Pay Secrecy Shake-Up. The taboo of talking to co-workers about pay is set for a shake-up in Australia, following an amendment to the Fair Work Act 2009 that bans pay secrecy clauses in new employment contracts. By Gary Anders. Article begins. When it comes to office conversations, asking a co-worker how much they earn is one of the top no-go zones. However, it may also qualify as a breach of contract, with many existing employment contracts containing clauses that prohibit workers from discussing their pay, even by choice. Australia's position has now changed in law with the Fair Work Legislation Amendment, Secure Jobs, Better Pay, Act 2022, receiving royal assent on 6th of December 2022. The Act, among other things, prohibits pay secrecy clauses in all new employment contracts. It also introduces workplace rights that legally permit employees to talk to each other about their remuneration, including any terms and conditions of their employment relevant to remuneration outcomes. Pay secrecy terms in existing employment contracts will also no longer be enforceable. Employees may use this information, if provided by one or more co-workers, to assess whether their remuneration is fair and comparable to that of others in the same workplace or industry and in the same or in a similar role. In a sense, Australia is playing catch-up. The removal of pay secrecy clauses in new employment contracts mirrors the progress in other countries, particularly in the US, the UK, and throughout Europe. The move is part of a broad push by many governments towards achieving greater pay transparency to eliminate wage discrepancies based on gender, race, and other unfair workplace practices. At the same time, other legal changes overseas are aimed at helping job seekers avoid applying for roles with salaries below their expectations. In the US, for example, New York City recently enacted legislation that requires companies to include the minimum and maximum pay for all their job listings, regardless of the role being advertised. Employers who fail to post salaries will receive a warning. Repeat offenders can face fines of up to $250,000 per violation, equivalent of 361,000 Australian dollars. Advertised salaries have been widely used across Australia for quite some time, most prominently for all public sector positions. More recently, momentum towards increased pay transparency across the private sector has grown, with some major banks actively removing pay secrecy clauses from their permanent and temporary employment contracts. Michelle Brown, Professor of Human Resource Management at the University of Melbourne, says trying to reduce the gender pay gap is a common theme underscoring these changes. She says, "That's been a very substantial motivation for this legislation because there is a lot of research to suggest that pay secrecy is a contributor to the gender pay gap." Brown points to research covering 11 states in the US that have introduced prohibitions on pay secrecy, where a labour market economist compared the wage outcomes for women in those states to women in states where pay secrecy is still permitted. Brown explains, "There was a difference in pay of anywhere between 4% and 12%, with the women, where there is a prohibition on pay secrecy, getting paid more than the women in the other states." So, how does the prohibition on pay secrecy lead to women being paid more? According to Brown, we know that under conditions of secrecy, organisations can make decisions that may be ad hoc and may reflect other stereotypes. When you have transparency, organisations simply must have better systems which they can defend. Jessica Pratt, senior lawyer at Toop Workplace Law, agrees that removing pay secrecy is about limiting the incidence of gender pay discrimination and making employers more accountable. The new pay transparency laws prohibit employers from entering into new employment contracts with pay secrecy clauses. In existing employment contracts, such terms will have no legal effect. This means employers will not be able to enforce pay secrecy terms in existing contracts. Pratt recommends that employers update employment contract templates to remove any pay secrecy clauses, review existing contracts and arrangements, and adopt a best practice approach. Pratt says, "My view is that employers should go beyond compliance and implement best practice by having robust remuneration processes in place so that they ensure they adopt a holistic strategy in order to create a more equitable workplace." She adds, "It has to be a part of a broader strategy of ensuring there are proper processes in place to confirm that an organisation's remuneration practices are inclusive, up to date, and that regular gender pay audits are conducted, so there are no unintended consequences." Pratt believes there may be a rise in discrimination claims against some employers, but that transparency should have positive outcomes for organisations, especially in staff retention. Tony Peters, CPA, Director of Professional Services at IT recruitment and advisory firm Implementium, says he still sees a lot of employment contracts with pay secrecy clauses. Peters says, "Predominantly in Australia, you do see pay secrecy clauses in contracts stating that employees cannot discuss their pay with anybody, particularly their peers." Peters says that some employers have included clauses for their own protection to avoid sensitive pay information being discussed internally or leaked to external competitors. He explains, "From an employer point of view, people running a business, there's an element of confidentiality in terms of what they do. But obviously, employers can use pay secrecy as a strategy to control wages and salaries. It is a proven strategy or tactic that works. If you don't know what your colleague earns, how can you bargain? How can you negotiate? What is your benchmark? This all feeds into the gender pay gap." The new pay transparency requirements built into the Act are likely to have far-reaching consequences across the Australian employment landscape. Brown says that, based on developments overseas, many employers will need to become more accountable in justifying their pay decisions to employees. She says, "The other thing is that we will actually see organisations making different kinds of decisions. There are some interesting studies that show organisations often tend to hire more women into higher paying roles under conditions of pay transparency. The changes aren't just in terms of accountability, we're also seeing organisations hiring more women into bigger positions or promoting women into higher paying positions as well. At a base level, the changes will spur some employees to negotiate for higher salaries. To attract applicants, employers are likely to need to provide more salary information in their job advertisements." Brown says, "We do know that potential job applicants do look at the amount of information in the job advertisement, and it does have implications for whether they apply or not. We do see that people are reluctant to apply for jobs if they don't see how much they're going to get paid. The other reason why the pay information on a job advertisement is important is because employees see it as telling them something about the fairness and trustworthiness of the organisation. It signals that the organisation is going to treat people fairly and equitably because it has pay ranges." In the Australian context, Peters believes that pay transparency will result in labour costs increasing in the short term because employees will have greater bargaining power. Peters says, "For some employers, there will be disharmony and there will be conflict and disgruntled employees if they find out there's someone sitting next to them doing the same role and getting paid a different rate. There will be chaos in some places." However, Peters says candidates who need to find work urgently will accept lower salaries, which will push wages down. He explains, "In the short term, it will be great because it will start addressing things like the gender pay gap. But in the longer term, there may be a levelling effect where some pays will go up and some higher pays may come down." research conducted by the Harvard Business Review entitled "The Unintended Consequences of Pay Transparency" has found evidence that pay transparency can actually compress pay levels rather than elevate them. Specifically, it has found that in businesses adopting pay transparency practices, managers were inclined to reduce pay dispersion amongst employees by making their salaries and other incentives similar. Peters says, "It's often time-consuming and psychologically draining for them to address employee complaints and salary adjustment requests. So we found that they take steps to reduce differences in compensation within the same job level." Harvard Business Review has also found that employees who experience transparency-induced pay compression are likely to seek alternative ways to receive the reward they feel is due to them. This may include non-monetary benefits, additional career training, or other incentives. Brown says, "We have done a lot of interviews with organisations about why they have pay secrecy. What is common in every interview we have ever done is that there is a view the organisation will descend into chaos if everybody knows each other's pay. But there is nothing in the legislation that says businesses have to pay everyone the same amount. It simply means that you have to be able to justify the differences." What does this all mean for human resources? According to Brown, it means making sure you have a rational, defensible pay system.